Well, joining us now for a conversation, red crown rot is an issue that is spreading across much of the soybean belt, all the way from the eastern side, Indiana, Kentucky, into parts of Iowa, Missouri, etc. There's a lot of concern here with RCR. We're going to talk about this and some of the challenges and maybe some of the ways we can help to combat red crown rot as we especially look into next year's growing season and beyond. Joining us for a conversation, agronomic service representative from Syngenta covering Kansas and Missouri, Brian Norton is with us here today on the show. Brian, good to talk with you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on.
Let's just start and maybe give us a bit of a synopsis of red crown rot. I know it's a disease that, as I mentioned, spreading more and more here over really the past year or so in our soybeans. What are some of the big key signs that we're seeing red crown rot in a soybean field, Brian?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one of the challenges for red crown rot is some of the symptoms that we could see out there in a field actually are mimicked by other diseases that were more common to see in our soybeans field. So for an example, where I work in the state of Missouri, we have a lot of sudden death syndrome. That foliar scorch or interveinal yellowing or chlorosis that sudden death syndrome gives us can also look like red crown rot. So they can kind of get confused back and forth. Red crown rot will give you that foliar symptoms of the leaf, but it'll also, hence its name red crown rot, give you some reddening of the lower stem and roots. Reddening of the lower stem and roots of a soybean plant can also be look like rhizoctonia, for an example. So there's a lot of things going on in a soybean field, and some folks, it's really difficult to distinguish between many of their different diseases that are out there. Red crown rot is definitely one that's we're starting to see pop up more and more all the time.
Is it a matter of getting out and scouting early in a growing season or pulling soil samples, testing? Is it post-season, after harvest, trying to do some examinations to figure out if you have red crown rot in your fields? I mean, what are some of the ways we can try to fight this?
Yeah, great question. So really for me, I think about red crown rot, you're going to see two different stages for red crown rot in a growing season. First, you have the initial infection stage, which happens very shortly after planting. So warm, wet soil conditions after planting, this red crown rot begins to colonize around the root system. It is a root disease, so it begins to impact the plant in that manner. Now, unfortunately, we don't usually see any symptoms to the plant at that time, early season. You usually don't see the symptoms until later in the growing season, into the reproductive phase, when those soybeans are starting to bloom, put pods on. And at that point, when we have nice moisture events, you start flushing that toxin out of the root system up into the plant. And that's when you start seeing that foliar or leaf scorch that we mentioned earlier. So that's really when folks are going to start seeing that disease. And one of the things we're trying to talk to our growers about now is, as you see that disease, don't just make the assumption that it's sudden death syndrome or it's brown stem rot. Let's grab some samples, send them off to your local university, your plant pathology lab, have them identify exactly what we've got going on out here so we can get a better scope of how big the scenario and the problem with red crown rot is. Red crown rot's been in the United States since the 1970s. We've primarily thought of it as a southern disease, Louisiana, Mississippi. It's not been for the last 4 or 5 years that we've really started identifying it up in the upper Midwest. Illinois, 2018, Kentucky, 2021, just a couple years ago out in Indiana. And this past year in 2024 is where we found it for the first time in the state of Missouri. Now, not saying it wasn't there before, but were we identifying it properly prior to 2024?
Well, I think about this, Brian, and you mentioned it, some similarities between other diseases, and we got plenty of issues out there that we have to fight every year in our soybean fields, whether it's red crown rot, SDS. I think about soybean cyst nematodes, for example, pest pressures, disease pressures, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of times I hear about multiple modes of action being a way to combat some of these issues. Talk about that from your perspective. What should we be thinking about on the agronomic side here as we move, say, into 2025 and we're starting to think about what we're going to do for next year's crop?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the first thing when we start thinking about a disease is a lot of times we start looking at, okay, should we change our rotation and limit then the inoculum development of disease in that field? Because this is a soil-borne disease with red crown rot. Recommendations now are to move away from a host crop for 2 years. So that would be plant something like corn, for an example, for a couple years in a row. A lot of my growers that I work with in the state of Missouri, soybeans are part of the rotation. So they're going to keep the beans in that rotation, unfortunately. The next thing we talk a lot about is genetic selection, right? How are our genetics rated for tolerance or susceptibility to disease? Today on the market, I'm not aware of any soybeans that are being marketed as tolerant to red crown rot, no resistance to red crown rot. So that takes that option off the table as well. So, some things, improving drainage. This is one of those early season diseases where you have warm soils plus saturated soils is where it gets started. So if you can improve some drainage. The other thing is there is some seed treatments that can be utilized. There's a couple that are on the market today. Syngenta has Saltro seed treatment that has a Section 2EE labeling in Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Tennessee, Kentucky, where you could apply Saltro for help suppress red crown rot. What we're trying to do there with that particular product is delay the onset of that disease. So those soybeans stay greener longer into the grain fill period, therefore less reduction in yield from that application.
Well, good thoughts as we kind of sum this all up. And again, dealing with red crown rot and more moving forward. I think a lot of it comes back to, you mentioned, getting samples off to your local university, things like that, working with your local agronomist, your local retailer, having a plan in place. I think it's super important, isn't it, Brian?
Absolutely. And that plan really needs to start with, what did you see in that field last year? Or maybe what did you see in that field 2 years ago when you had it in soybeans? So, what pests were you seeing, so we can start identifying what actions we need to take specifically to reduce the impact to things like red crown rot, which again is new on the radar that we really haven't had to look at the last 4 or 5 years, but it's definitely something that we need to be concerned about moving forward into 2025.
And I'm sure if growers want to learn about Saltro from Syngenta, if they contact their local retailer or go to syngenta-us.com, they can find more information, right, Brian?
Absolutely. You want to make sure you check for your specific states, see if they have that 2EE labeling for using Saltro as a seed treatment to help suppress red crown rot.
Fantastic. Brian Norton with Syngenta. Thanks for joining us, giving us some tips and things to consider when it comes to red crown rot in our soybeans. We appreciate the time. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Jesse.